Hello, my name is Scott Yanko. I'm a postdoctoral associate at the Max Planck Yale Center for Biodiversity Movement and Global Change in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at Yale University. I'm very excited to be joining you here today. Of course, I would have much preferred that we were standing next to a group of cranes talking about all of this, but alas, that's where we're at. Nonetheless, I'm very excited to share some of my work on flammulated owls with you all, including work that's being done just outside the San Luis Valley, just on the fringes of the San Luis Valley, in an area called the Hot Creek Research Natural Area. And I'll tell you more about that now. But my research in general, despite focusing on flammulated owls, is really concerning sort of trying to understand why we see such a great diversity of movement strategies across the animal kingdom. And we really do see a stunning diversity. And so just a few examples of those here before we dive in to the owls. Trying to sort of illustrate that diversity. So this is a classic example many bird watchers might be familiar with. It's the migration route of the Arctic tern, and it's enormous. They go pole to pole, about as far as you can go, and nesting in the Arctic and wintering in the Antarctic. So tens of thousands of miles covered every year. On the other end of the spectrum, some life forms will hardly move at all. So barnacles might move once, a single dispersal as a polyp, choose a location to reside, and then never move again for the remainder of their lives. And for some species, this can be quite a long time, right? So some sea sponges will exhibit a similar life cycle, which may mean remaining in one place for thousands or even up to 10,000 years. Some of these movements are incredibly complicated. So the Monarch Butterfly is a phenomenal example of this. This is a round trip migration that unfolds over the course of several generations, something like 5 generations. So the monarchs that are wintering down in the central transvolcanic belt of south central Mexico in the spring will start the migration north, but they won't complete it, right? They'll stop and reproduce, and the next generation will continue that migration north. And each successive generation brings them up to the northern tier states into southern Canada. Eventually fall arrives, and that final generation will make the entire southbound trip back to Mexico and overwinter there and repeat the cycle. These movements can also be massive in terms of just pure biomass. And so massive that we can actually detect them on weather radar. So there's examples of this from birds and insects. This picture that I'm showing you here is a line of dragonflies moving south out of Oklahoma City and the vicinity in the fall following a cold front. Some of the movements are just downright bizarre and fascinating, right? So flying fish have a modified pectoral fin that they use to sort of leap out of the ocean to avoid predation. Similarly, just fascinating movement strategies from the magnificent frigate bird. They can reach altitudes in excess of 20,000 feet. They can stay aloft for weeks at a time, sometimes not flapping even for days, having to sleep on the wing, and doing so incredibly efficiently by using updrafting winds that are created by winds hitting the surface of waves. And it's also important to keep in mind that some of these movements can actually be quite small, right? This isn't always about sort of really long distance migrations. The movement ecology can deal with small ones. And so this map is actually showing what we call vertical diel migration. And so in the world's oceans, zooplankton often want to be up near the surface where the waters are most productive feeding. But during the day, they're also exposed to predation by being up near the surface because the waters are light. The sunlight can penetrate and predators can see them. And so oftentimes what they'll do is sort of sink down the water column during the day, come back up to feed at night. And you get this up and down sort of commute over the course of the day. These researchers in this map actually mapped the strength of that commuting as a function of how clear the water was in the world's oceans. And so they showed that the clearest waters had the greatest strength of this diel migration. And so that brings us to the movements that I study in this species, the flammulated owl. So it's North America's second smallest owl. The alpha owl's got it beat by, I think, like 1/4 of an inch. But they're small. They're a couple of ounces. So, picture a sea battery. You can hold them in a single hand. They're insectivorous, so they're primarily feeding on moths at night, sometimes some grasshoppers and crickets and other things like that, but primarily they're eating moths. They're a secondary cavity nester, so they're using abandoned woodpecker cavities as their nests. This one here, you can actually see we've carved it out a little bit to access the young to take some measurements. And those hands holding the owl in the first picture are actually Dr. Brian Linkhart's. He's an ornithologist and a professor at Colorado College, and he studied the species since the early 1980s. And one of the ways that he has studied the species is using a technique called radio telemetry. Of course, this is a picture of me. I don't have any pictures of Brian with the radio gear from the 80s, although I wish I did. And the way the radio telemetry works is actually quite clever. So we put a little backpack on the owls that emits a radio pulse, in our case, every second. And using that antenna that I'm holding, called a Yagi antenna, I can sort of receive that pulse. And so although you can't see it in my mop of hair, I would be wearing headphones, and every second I could hear a beep. And as long as I point that antenna in the correct direction, that beep sounds louder to me. So using that, you can sort of run around the landscape and chase down these owls and find the specific tree that they're sitting in. And so Brian did this in the early 80s. And in fact, he's doing this with these cool old metal tags, some of which are still out in our study areas. There's a picture of one that I found. And so he would go out there, find the trees that these birds had used for a particular behavior, make note of it, put the metal tag in the tree. And then in the 80s, of course, what you'd have to do is go back the next day and using a compass and a map and some triangulation, try to figure out exactly where on the landscape you were to make a map of this. But what this information can tell us is exactly what habitats they're using, and we can sort of quantify how that landscape affects other aspects of the species biology. And the key finding from his research is that what the owls key in on is these big old trees on the landscape, right? So flammulated owls are largely in mid-elevation pine forests. So Ponderosa pine, Douglas fir forests in Colorado. And what they really want are big old trees. So that tree on the left in particular is a classic example of an old Ponderosa pine. You can always tell they get this sort of bonsai look. The tops flatten out when they get to about 200 years old. Knowing this tree here, this is up high on a very dry ridge. That tree is almost certainly well in excess of 200 years old, probably exceeding 400 years old. And what Dr. Linkhart's research has showed us is that the birds prefer to forage in these trees. They prefer to sing in them. They prefer to roost in them. They prefer territories that contain greater proportions of these trees. And those territories with the greatest proportion of those trees produce more of these, right? More babies. So they're really important to the species' reproductive success. The other important thing to know about this type of forest is that it's fire prone. Throughout Western North America, fires are just a feature of these landscapes. And we see this gradient as you move from south to north, or as you move up in elevation, where at southern locations and low elevations, the fires tend to be low severity. So mostly ground fires like you see in this image here, consuming fine fuels and shrubs, but leaving the forest canopy largely intact, right? So most of the big old mature trees would survive. That's aided, in fact, by some really cool fire adaptations of Ponderosa pines. So Ponderosa pines self-prune. As they grow older, they'll drop their lowest branches. They have this really thick, flaky bark that as it catches on fire, will kind of flake off and pull the fire away from the tree. And so it's a very fire-adapted ecosystem. As you move to higher latitudes or higher elevations, stand replacing fire becomes the norm, right? You might have fires that are occurring very infrequently. So whereas in the desert Southwest or in the Southwestern United States, you might get fires every even 15 or 30 years. If you were up somewhere like the Yellowstone region, for example, it might be every 100 to 400 years. But when it does burn, it's nearly 100% crown mortality. And of course, there's lots of forests where you would have a mix of these fire types. And in much of Colorado, that would be how we would describe it. So we would expect sort of patches of high severity burn and patches of low severity burn across those habitat types. Two things have really worked against us in this regard, though. And this year is no exception, right? I mean, after the really tragic fires in Boulder, we know that fires are really changing their behavior across Colorado. Climate is one major driver of this. We know that we're making the climate warmer and drier in Colorado, and that just makes conditions for fires more right all the time. The other thing that's happened is we've historically suppressed fires. And so over the last 100 or so years, there's been a real lack of fire in our forests. And that allows those fine fuels that typically would have been consumed early on because of a low severity fire build up, and it creates ladders into the crown. So we have this real transition from low to high severity fire regimes. And what that ends up producing is landscapes like this, even in areas where we would have expected the trees to survive because the forests were more dense, the conditions were hotter. And so this is a picture of the Hayman Fire, which until recently was the largest fire in the state's history. is something like 212,000 hectares. It's since been surpassed. But it left large swaths of really high severity burns. So in this landscape, for example, we know from previous research that we would expect about a quarter to a third of the landscape in any given fire to be a high severity burn. And in the Hayman Fire, it was well over 50%, close to 2/3 of this fire area burned at high severity. This offered us an opportunity, however, to try to understand how animals inhabiting these burned landscapes, such as the flammulated owl, respond. So what we did is just sort of repeated that study design that I told you about with Dr. Linkhart's radio telemetry work. So we attached tags to a bunch of owls, and then I ran around the woods and chased them down to their trees, and we can record their positions on the landscape. And we end up with these maps like this, right? So each of these black dots represents a place where we were able to chase an owl down with a radio tag on. And then we can use some satellite information to try to understand the severity of the fire in that habitat, right? So how much of the forest is remaining alive. And what we can see is that at a landscape scale, these owls are choosing territories with relatively little high severity burn. So in other words, when you get these really hot fires that come through and wipe out large swaths of forest, they're no longer suitable habitat for species like the flammulated owl, which are of course adapted to these fire-prone ecosystems, right? So you're seeing sort of a state change in these ecosystems. And that brings us back down to the San Luis Valley, which I promised we would talk about, right? So we're trying to extend upon this existing research at an area called the Hot Creek Research Natural Area. So just southwest of the Monte Vista area. This is a part of the Rio Grande National Forest set aside specifically for scientific research. It's a really beautiful stretch of forest, sort of sloping, old, dry Ponderosa pine forests, dissected by these larger sort of deep canyons full of aspens and blue spruces, and then these really gorgeous meadow complexes. And so over the last 5 or so years, we've been studying the reproductive biology and the movements of flammulated owls in the Hot Creek Research Natural Area with an eye towards fire. So one thing that we know in Hot Creek is that fire has long been suppressed here. So this is actually an image of a little spot fire that popped up a couple summers ago and burned about an acre before the firefighters got it out. But we actually have records of the fire history here. It's a really cool technique that fire researchers use using tree cores and what they call dendrochronology. Basically, you can see the scars from previous fires in the tree record. And by dating those fire scars using the rings of the tree, you can actually do this across a forest plot and understand the history of the fire. So in this case, each of the horizontal lines is a single tree that the researchers looked at, and each of the little triangles represents a fire scar that they observed. And so when you sort of line these trees up by their dates, right, and we can tell good growing years to sort of match up to match up the tree rings across time, we can reconstruct the fire history for a site. And so you can see somewhere like Hot Creek, there were fires every few years, right? Every certainly no more than every few decades until you get to 1900. And there's that one last big fire right around 1900, and then essentially no detectable fires for the next 100 years. So we know that fire has been excluded from this ecosystem. We know that this ecosystem historically was fire dependent. And so in a lot of cases, what we're trying to do across the West is reintroduce fire, actually. There's challenges to doing so, and it's probably a much more complicated topic than I can cover in my talk here about flammulated owls and movement. But know that in Hot Creek Research Natural Area, that's actually one of the only research natural areas in the country with its own management plan that calls for the reintroduction of fire as a natural process in here. And so what we're trying to do is develop a study to understand how the owls are moving prior to the introduction of fire, what the habitat looks like prior to the introduction of fire, and then the Forest Service will come in and burn it, and we'll be able to understand what the implications of that as a management tool are, right? So building on our findings in the Hayman Fire. And we're trying to do this in some really interesting ways. So we have not just radio tags on these birds, but GPS tags, and I'll tell you more about those. We're trying to get better maps of the landscape, including maps of sort of the caloric landscape. So I told you these guys capture moths. So we built these series of moth traps to sample the community of moths. We can even use stable isotope chemistry techniques to sort of track the moths up into the owls using sort of chemical signatures of what they're eating, trying to understand exactly what their prey is. We also spend a lot of time going out and mapping features of the habitat that are relevant to the owls. So we have these sort of like a closed circuit camera system on a telescoping pole so that we can find nests and assess cavities, but we end up with these maps of all the cavity trees across the landscape and in what different species of trees they are, right? So we can watch how those resources change when fire gets introduced. And this is all very exciting work that's ongoing. The forest hasn't been burned yet. It was slated to be burned over the last couple of years, and both COVID and actually other large fire emergencies that took the fire resource staff away from our site because they're dealing with real emergencies both in and outside of Colorado have delayed the introduction of fire. So this part of the work is actually ongoing, and maybe in a few years I'll be able to come back and tell you more about what we learned specifically there. In the meantime, we're also using this site as the basis for some larger scale studies about the bigger movements that these birds make. So not just their day-to-day foraging and commuting to and from their nests, but how are they dealing with this winter, right? The other overwhelming feature of these mid-elevation forests, besides the fact that they are fire prone, is that they're prone to winter. And these verdant, lush habitats become really barren, difficult places to survive come winter. And if you're an insectivore, that's a real challenge to deal with. And so when I first started working with this species, something like 17 years ago now, this is what we knew about their seasonal movements. We had a range map. Nobody had ever exactly documented an individual migrating. We suspected that they did because we know that they disappear from high latitudes. There's some cool old papers actually that make some crazy hypotheses about what they might actually be doing, but we sort of suspected that they migrated. We knew that there were populations down in South Central Mexico and even into Guatemala that you could find birds during the winter. Dr. Linkhart and I put at the time, groundbreaking technology on these birds in the early 2010s called a light level geolocator. One of the central challenges in tracking animals at long distances is that the technology is just too heavy for most species. So at the time, this was the best technology that we could put on a bird that only weighed a couple ounces. So it was a tiny little backpack with a light stock, and all it would do is measure the levels of light over time. And using the same sort of calculations that sailors in the 15th century using a sextant would do, we could calculate an approximate position on the Earth, right? So if you know the length of the day and the relative time of solar noon, you can approximate your location on the planet. Of course, it's not very precise, right? Plus or minus, dozens of miles, but pretty good if you have if your next best guess is nothing. Excuse me. So using these geolocators, we were able to track 4 owls down to Mexico. So the first 4 owls that were ever directly observed migrating. Oh, the other thing that's neat about this technology is you have to catch the birds again, right? So we put these tags on in 1 year, and then we have to come back the next summer, hope that the birds came back, hope that we're able to catch that same bird and that the tag worked, right? So it takes a lot of effort actually to just get these 4 tags, but it confirmed what we suspected, right? That they're going down to South Central Mexico somewhere. And it turns out that region that they're going to is exactly where those monarch butterflies I told you in our first slide are going, right? So those monarchs are in a really cool high elevation forest type down there called the Oyamel. It's all this fir forest up above 10,000 feet. The owls there are observations of owls up in that OML, but just below that, the next elevation band below that are these really beautiful pine oak forests. And our suspicion is that that's where those birds were going. So Dr. Linkart and I actually went down to Mexico to try to catch some of these birds. That's one of the birds we caught in Mexico. You can see that's the light stalk. So at the time we were actually trying to do some tracking in reverse. So put geolocators on birds in Mexico and see where they go for the summer. Or if they go, some of these birds may be non-migrant down there as well. You can see many of the birds down in Mexico have a much more sort of rufous look, which is an interesting phenomenon across birds, that in hot, humid environments, birds get redder, interestingly. But yeah, super cool habitats down there. And in many places look very similar to Colorado, which is no surprise. But that technology is challenging to work with because we have very little precision about it, right? We basically know roughly within plus or minus, 20, 30, 40 miles where a bird was on any given day. So if we really want to know anything about the environmental conditions experienced during winter or on the way during their migrations with any precision, we need better technology. And thankfully, it's improved quite a bit. So the tag that you see on this bird here is actually a GPS unit now. And so this will record the individual's locations within just a few feet, right? It's just as good as the GPS on your phone. It is still hampered by the fact that our birds are too small to carry the tags that will transmit. So we still need to capture the bird again the next year and download those data. Now, lest it seem like I'm complaining too much about the tracking technology that I have available, I'm gonna tell you about the first ever marked birds that helped researchers understand migration to some degree. So not so long ago, actually, it wasn't totally clear that birds migrated. It was definitely one of the hypotheses and one of the theories, but you can find people talking about swallows becoming fish during the winter or turning into other birds for the winter, right? It's very difficult to document a migration directly. This picture that I'm showing you here is of what's called a file stork, and it's a white stork from Germany that showed up with this spear through its neck. And in fact, not just one of them, there were enough of them they came up with a whole word for it, right? So I think there's something like 20 something of these documented in all time. And what ornithologists were able to do is take those spears, engage with their colleagues in the anthropology department to understand sort of the human history of those spears, like what part of Africa would a spear look like that from? And then you get an actual point on a map, right? They could actually tell, oh, this bird has been in, South Africa or wherever exactly it came from. And now you have 2 points on the map, right? You can confirm a migration that way. So I will not complain about GPS, which I have to capture again to download the data. And in fact, we really are in a golden age of animal tracking, and I'll tell you some more about that before leaving today. But so we put a bunch of these on, and this is what we get. So on the left, you see an animation of a few of my birds from Colorado. I could just sit and watch these animations all day long of these birds moving south down to Mexico, spending the winter. It will start back north. Most of them, the batteries die before they quite make it up to Colorado, so we lose them somewhere in the Big Bend area. We also deployed tags at other sites in the West. So some sites in southern Idaho on the Wasatch Front in Utah, some from the mountains outside of Albuquerque, and then the Teller County sites in Colorado. We do a lot of things with these data, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time digging into all the science that we get to do with them, but one of the cool things we can do when the data are this high spatiotemporal resolution is grab other environmental data to ask questions about what the birds are experiencing as they move across 20 degrees of latitude over an entire year. And so just as one example, these are the nighttime temperatures experienced by all those owls over an entire annual cycle. So this y-axis here, again, night temperature, it's degrees Celsius. We actually get this from satellites, right? So the NASA MODIS satellite system can measure nighttime temperatures basically across the entire planet at 250 meter resolution. And we can take our GPS points and associate those measurements together. And what we see is that with the exception of a couple periods of the year, they're experiencing this really narrow band of temperatures, right? So, 0 Celsius is 32 Fahrenheit, up to maybe 20 degrees Celsius, something like 70 degrees, right? So they're staying in that just above freezing zone, except for the shoulders of the breeding season, right? They're arriving just when it's getting warm enough, experiencing summer here, and right as it gets cold again, they split for Mexico and experience these really stable conditions. So for all this movement, they're really ending up with environmental constancy, which we think is actually one of the hallmarks of why animals migrate in the first place, right? Is to dampen those curves of seasonality so that they're dealing with relatively predictable resources and environments across the annual cycle. So I told you I'd tell you a little bit more about how we're really truly in the golden age of, of animal tracking. The next generation of tracking devices is what you see here. It's called the Icarus System. They're almost small enough to put on a flammulated owl. And in fact, the engineers say that within a couple of years, we'll have them small enough, right? So I'm dealing with tags that are a gram. They weigh a gram, so like a penny. These are a couple of grams. But the Icarus satellite system uses GPS satellites, just like that GPS system I was telling you, but it uploads the data to an antenna on the International Space Station. So it has a second antenna, and as the space station passes overhead over these animals, the data are uploaded and then sent to the individual researchers. And this is groundbreaking, right? Because all the animals we put tags on are now providing data, whereas previously we would put tags on animals that we would never see again. And that's not great, right? It's impacting an animal and we're not getting anything from it. It's also a source of bias, right? We don't just want to study the animals that survive. We also want to know where are migratory animals dying. I think many of you probably saw the paper a few years ago about 3 billion birds lost, right? There's a notable decline in the total abundance in birds across North America to the tune of 3 billion. Fewer birds now than there were, I think, in the 1970s. And it's critical that we understand the sources of mortality driving patterns like that. And systems like Icarus are going to open that up, as well as all kinds of other avenues of research. And so this figure is from a paper that, well, from the time that I'm talking to you is soon to come out. It's probably going to be out by the time you hear this talk, just showing some of the data that we're getting from mountain plovers in South Park, Colorado, to godwits, to sooty terns in the Seychelles, red-footed falcons, European blackbirds. I mean, really just across taxa, an amazing revolution, and it's contributing to a public data set. There's up to 6 billion records now of animal movement on this website called movebank.org, where scientists are able to store and share data. Some of the work that I do now here at Yale is building on these data sets. And so I'm just one quick plug. Again, it should be coming soon from when I'm speaking with you. By the time you hear this talk, it's likely to be live. If not, check back. It's animallives.org. One of the things we're doing is taking some of these live data streams so you can see and explore the tracks of individual animals. And we're annotating them with these environmental data. So if you want to understand the elevations the birds are at, the temperatures, we use a measurement called NDVI, which tells us how green the earth was, essentially how productive of a habitat are they in, right? And you can actually play around with these annotations and explore these movements of individual animals yourself. So really, we're increasingly using incredible technology to get better and better measurements of how these animals move, which is allowing us to make better and better predictions about things like environmental change, climate change, and what we should expect from our ecosystems as a result. And so with that, I'll thank you for listening. There are a zillion people to thank for work like this. It takes literally dozens of field assistants and collaborators, funders and partners. In particular, I'd like to thank the folks at the Rio Grande National Forest for their incredible support of this project throughout. And I have some contact information there, a couple of websites there. If you have follow-up questions or whatever, you can find my direct contact information on my website. You can see some of the work we're doing here at the Center for Biodiversity Movement and Global Change if you go to the mpyc.yale.edu. And again, animallives.org should be live if you want to stare at some animal tracks. And so with that, I'll thank you again, and hopefully you're enjoying massive movement of cranes through the San Luis, and yeah, I look forward to being there myself soon. Thanks.